They said a Tudor woman's body belonged to her family, her husband, even her king, but never to herself. It was traded, judged, corrected, and condemned in ways the world pretended not to see. Every bruise of duty, every demand of lineage, every silence she carried shaped a history written without her consent. Tonight, we step into the quiet war that lives beneath their skin. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If one were to step quietly into the great halls of Tudor noble estates, one would find that every smile, every whispered agreement, and every arranged meeting rested upon the bodies of young women who had no say in their own futures. Families gathered around long tables, drawing lines between houses as if mapping out territories. And in the center of these conversations stood the fate of a daughter whose worth lay not in her voice, but in the alliances her body could secure. To outsiders, the rituals of betrothal looked refined and orderly, filled with polite gestures and ceremonial gifts. Yet beneath that polished surface lived an unspoken understanding that a woman's life was simply another piece in a larger negotiation. Parents evaluated potential matches with the same precision they applied to managing estates, weighing political benefits, land disputes, debts, favors, and rising ambitions. A girl might be barely old enough to hold a quill, yet her name could appear on documents, sealing ties between powerful families. Her body, still growing, still unformed, was spoken of as though it were property to be transferred, stabilizing fragile alliances and ensuring bloodlines continued in the direction the men desired. Nothing about these arrangements resembled affection or choice. Everything was strategic, measured, and cold. In noble households, young women learned early that their worth lived outside themselves. Their smiles were rehearsed, their posture corrected, their silence praised. Every compliment they received seemed to echo the same meaning, that they were valuable only because someone else wanted the land. Reputation or political advantage attached to them. Servants whispered as they prepared garments for formal gatherings, noting how a girl's appearance could shift negotiations subtly yet decisively. A pale complexion suggested purity, a calm demeanor implied obedience. Both could increase her family's leverage without her ever speaking a word. Suitors did not ask what these young women dreamed of or feared. They asked instead about lineage, dowry, fertility, and the political temperament of her relatives. A woman's hesitation, discomfort, or confusion never altered the direction of her life. Those things were considered irrelevant noise in a conversation that moved entirely above her head. The halls of Tudor nobility were filled with decisions made around her, never with her. When the moment of arrangement arrived, the exchange often felt ritualistic. Hands were shaken, documents were sealed, and the girl at the center of it all was expected to bow her head in acceptance. Her body became the path between two families, a passport of flesh, needed to secure peace, wealth, or dominance. Once the agreement was fixed, she no longer moved through her home as a daughter, but as a promise waiting to be delivered. What made the system so chilling was its normality. No one questioned the practice, not even the women who endured it. Mothers prepared their daughters for the same fate they once faced. Fathers spoke of honor and responsibility, believing themselves generous when offering their child to a more powerful house. The girl rarely resisted, not because she agreed, but because resistance held no meaning in a world where her desires could not alter the outcome. People walked through these halls as if nothing were wrong, as if the slow erasure of a woman's autonomy was simply the natural order of things. To stand in such a place, watching a young woman handed over like a carefully wrapped token, is to understand how quietly cruelty can root itself in society. The transaction required no violence, no raised voices, no threats. It was executed with grace, courtesy, and the soft shuffle of fine fabrics. Yet the weight it imposed on her life was irreversible. She did not enter marriage as a partner, but as a symbol, a guarantee, a bond sealed between powerful men. Her body, more than her name or character, carried the expectations of both families. Inside her new household, she would be observed not as an individual, but as evidence of the alliance, an object whose presence signaled peace or opportunity. The walls around her echoed with generations of women who had stood in the same place, their lives arranged with the same detachment. It was a cycle without interruption, maintained by tradition and barely questioned by those who benefited from it. In the quiet corners of these estates, the truth settled heavily. A woman could live her entire life, fulfilling the role others assigned to her, without ever owning a single decision that shaped her fate. Every corridor she walked through reminded her not of freedom, but of the price her body had paid to unite two houses. The more she complied, the more invisible she became, absorbed into the machinery of aristocratic expectation. And yet, the system endured because it appeared orderly, respectable, and even necessary. People feared instability more than they valued a woman's autonomy. They trusted the familiar patterns, believing that alliances forged through marriage strengthened the realm. But beneath the polished wood, embroidered gowns, and ceremonial exchanges lay a reality stripped of tenderness, a human life reduced to a transaction, a body used to hold together ambitions that were never her own. Their alliances were secured, but her freedom vanished with the sealing of those agreements. There was always another layer beneath these polite exchanges, one that carried consequences no one dared to name aloud. Some women would learn that being traded once was only the beginning of what their bodies would be forced to bear. In Tudor noble households, the future of a girl was often decided long before she understood what her own name meant. Discussions about her marriage began while she was still learning to walk steadily, passed between adults who viewed her life as a quiet extension of family ambition. Agreements were whispered across tables, sealed with nods and shared intentions, none of which required the slightest awareness from the child whose fate was being arranged. To the families involved, this was simply responsible planning, ensuring alliances early, so that no unexpected shifts in power could threaten their position. It was common for a girl not yet near adolescence to be promised to a boy she had never met, sometimes a child himself, sometimes a young man destined to inherit land or title. Her parents spoke of the arrangement with calm pride, as if offering her future were a sign of their competence and foresight. The girl, too young to grasp anything but the tone of their voices, would listen quietly, unaware that the words exchanged in her presence would one day determine the entire structure of her adult life. These choices, though permanent, felt routine to those making them. The betrothal of children was treated as a practical measure, no different from managing fields or drafting contracts. Feelings were irrelevant. Affection between spouses was a luxury reserved for stories, not noble houses. What mattered was the weight a girl carried through her family bloodline, how her existence could secure peace, settle disputes, or strengthen political ties. Her small body, still years away from maturity, was spoken of as though already prepared for the expectations placed upon it. Those who bargained for her future did not wait for her to grow. Her value lay not in who she would become, but in what she represented before she had even reached adolescence. For many of these girls, the childhood passed quietly under the shadow of their future roles. They were taught behaviors that would please their distant in-laws, habits that reflected well on their lineage, and manners meant to convey obedience long before they understood the purpose behind them. The home they grew up in was not truly theirs, for everyone knew she would eventually be sent elsewhere, fulfilling a promise she never made. Objects gifted to her, small trinkets, embroidered cloth, or books, were often symbols of the arrangement, reminders that her path had already been charted. Families rarely questioned the morality of binding children to one another. It was the way things had always been done, and tradition carried more authority than empathy. A girl could be promised to someone who lived far away, and no one considered whether she might fear the distance. She could be offered to a household with a reputation for severity, and no one paused to wonder how her young spirit might fare within its walls. Those decisions belonged to men concerned with their own legacies, not with the quiet anxiety of a child waiting for a future she could neither understand nor alter. The most striking part of this system was how accepted it remained across generations. The adults arranging these contracts had once been children in the same position, yet few viewed their own lack of choice as something worth challenging. They believed they had fulfilled their duty, and so would their daughters. The cycle persisted, not through force, but through the gentle, unthinking repetition of custom. The girls themselves, raised from infancy to expect nothing different, rarely imagined an alternative to the life decided for them. Walking through the corridors of such a household, one might see a young girl practicing her handwriting or learning to play an instrument, unaware that each skill she mastered would someday be judged by people outside her family. She moved through her days with a simplicity that contrasted sharply with the complexity of the negotiations surrounding her destiny. Her guardians praised her obedience, mistaking silence for acceptance, and took comfort in how easily she fit into the shape carved out for her long before she reached maturity. The truth lingered quietly behind all these preparations. A child's future could be traded away with the same detachment as a parcel of land. Her youth did not protect her from obligation. It merely made the decision easier for those who believed they knew best. In a noble society, her body was not seen as something that needed time to grow before commitments could be made. It was a piece in a long political arrangement, a small but essential element in the ambitions of those around her. These quiet agreements shaped her life long before she could speak for herself. There was always another stage waiting once her childhood ended, each one heavier than the last. Some families discovered that what they arranged in innocence would later unravel into consequences no one had anticipated. Virginity in Tudor noble society was treated not as a private condition of a young woman's body, but as a public emblem of family honor. Every decision made around her, every rule imposed on her behavior, stemmed from the belief that the intactness of a thin, unseen membrane could uphold or jeopardize an entire lineage. Within the walls of aristocratic households, daughters were watched closely, not out of affection or fear for their safety, but because their bodies carried political weight that exceeded their own understanding. A single misstep, even imagined, could stain the reputation of a house that had spent generations securing its position. The hymen was spoken of almost clinically, as though it were a legal seal or a marker guaranteeing purity. Parents, advisors, and even distant relatives referred to it indirectly, avoiding explicit language while still emphasizing its importance. Servants knew to guard the young mistress's privacy with obsessive care, limiting her movements, monitoring her interactions, and ensuring she never found herself alone with anyone who could compromise her future. The tone of this vigilance was rarely warm. It reflected duty, fear, and the quiet acceptance of a system that reduced a girl's value to the fragility of a physical detail. In many homes, the girl herself learned early what was expected of her. She was taught to walk with restraint, to lower her gaze, to avoid conversations with unfamiliar men, and to maintain a demeanor that implied untouched innocence. Adults around her spoke softly when discussing reputations, scandals, or broken engagements. Yet the message reached her clearly. Her body was not entirely her own. It carried the hopes of her parents, the ambitions of her house, and the delicate balance of political alliances that could rise or fall depending on her perceived purity. These lessons were not shouted. They settled gradually, shaping her sense of self long before she reached womanhood. Rumours could be as devastating as the truth. A whisper exchanged between nobles at a gathering, a careless comment from a servant, or a misinterpreted moment seen through a half-open door could ignite suspicion. Once doubt took root, it was difficult to erase. Families feared not only impropriety, but the mere appearance of it. A girl seen speaking too freely, laughing too loudly, or lingering at the wrong end of a corridor risked becoming the centre of speculation. To outsiders, these concerns seemed exaggerated, but to nobles entwined in fragile alliances, a tarnished reputation could destroy years of political planning. The weight of this scrutiny shaped daily life. Daughters rarely went anywhere unaccompanied, and social interactions were carefully staged to prevent misunderstandings. Clothing choices reflected the same caution. Gowns were selected to convey modesty, and even fabrics carried subtle messages about restraint. Invitations to events were evaluated for potential risk, and many young women lived under a gentle but constant confinement that was framed as protection. There was no acknowledgement of the pressure such vigilance created. Families believed they were acting responsibly by guarding what they saw as their most vulnerable asset. Despite this careful management, circumstances often exceeded control. Ill-intentioned rivals sometimes spread false stories to weaken a family's standing. An envious household, threatened by a competitor's rising influence, could quietly seed doubt about a daughter's purity. Knowing such accusations could halt negotiations or ruin a match entirely. The girl, caught in the centre of this manipulation, had no way to defend herself. She could only watch as decisions about her life were diverted by forces beyond her reach. Her voice drowned by the logic of political necessity. Inside her own mind, the expectations formed a cage. She learned to fear curiosity, conversation, and even harmless friendships. Any connection could be misinterpreted. Any moment of warmth could be used against her. Innocence was not a natural state, but a performance she was required to maintain without error. The slightest deviation risked the stability of her family, and so she lived cautiously, always aware that her reputation hovered over her like a fragile shield that could crack without warning. This system persisted because it blended seamlessly into the rhythm of aristocratic life. Those enforcing the rules believed they were upholding honor rather than restricting freedom. Mothers repeated the lessons they had once been taught, and fathers evaluated their daughters with a detached practicality that overlooked the human cost. The logic felt unshakable. Alliances depended on certainty, and certainty depended on chastity. Few questioned why so much rested on a detail barely understood by the very people who judged it so harshly. The truth, however, was that a girl's virginity functioned as a political fiction, useful, symbolic, and deeply unfair. It was never wholly about morality or virtue. It was about trust between families, leverage in negotiations, and the maintenance of social order. The burden of that system fell squarely on women, who were expected to uphold standards they did not create and could not challenge. Their bodies became sites of scrutiny, suspicion, and silent judgment, carrying responsibilities no child or young woman should have been forced to bear. These expectations held her life in place long before she reached adulthood. Unspoken consequences were waiting for those who slipped even slightly outside the boundaries drawn for them. A few families discovered that a single rumor, once released, could destroy much more than a future marriage. The virginity inspection of a Tudor bride was treated with an unsettling calm, as though it were merely another necessary step in the long sequence of formalities that surrounded noble marriage. Families spoke of it with the same detached tone they used when discussing dowries or land agreements, believing that certainty must precede any alliance. The young woman involved had no choice in the matter. her body was subject to examination not for her own sake, but to affirm the honour of two houses whose reputations depended on what a midwife or matron claimed to find. For those orchestrating these procedures, the inspection offered reassurance. For the bride, it marked the moment her body became public territory. These examinations were often conducted in quiet rooms, prepared specifically for the purpose, spaces that smelled of herbs, cloth, and apprehension. The young bride, dressed in garments chosen for modesty rather than comfort, entered with lowered eyes, aware that her composure would be scrutinized as closely as her flesh. Waiting inside were midwives or experienced matrons, women whose long familiarity with childbirth gave them authority in matters of anatomy. They were chosen not for their gentleness, but for their supposed objectivity. Their word carried significant weight, and no one questioned their methods. The inspection itself was cloaked in euphemisms. Families avoided direct language, referring instead to assurances, certainty, or proper confirmation. Yet everyone understood what the process entailed: the bride's innocence, a concept discussed endlessly in noble circles, was reduced to a physical verification performed by strangers. It was a deeply invasive act, framed as protection. Protection for families, for alliances, for the groom, for the social order, but never for the woman whose privacy was being stripped away. She was expected to endure the procedure silently, as though discomfort were a sign of virtue. Once the examination concluded, the results spread silently through the household. A favorable declaration, a confirmation of the bride's untouched state, brought a sense of relief, often expressed through measured nods rather than open celebration. The alliance could proceed without fear of scandal. Conversely, any uncertainty, hesitation, or unfavorable implication produced immediate tension. Even the most respected midwives sometimes struggled to assert whether their findings were definitive, and their uncertainty could be dangerous. Families, desperate to preserve their dignity, sometimes blamed the bride for appearing doubtful, as if speculation alone were evidence of wrongdoing. The consequences of a questionable result could be devastating. Engagements were broken, negotiations collapsed, and reputations withered overnight. Daughters who had lived carefully for years suddenly found themselves the subjects of suspicion, denied a future they had never chosen. Whispered conversations replaced polite greetings. Servants exchanged glances. Prospective in-laws withdrew quietly, unwilling to attach themselves to uncertainty. A single phrase from the midwife could undo months of planning and years of family ambition. Despite the emotional cost, these inspections persisted because the nobility considered them rational. Men who negotiated marriages believed they deserved guarantees, as though human bodies could be measured with the precision of property. Women who had endured the examination in their youth often supported the practice for their daughters, convinced it preserved order. It was a custom that passed from generation to generation, not because it was kind, but because it was familiar. People preferred predictability over discomfort. Tradition overshadowed empathy. In many households, the bride's preparation for this ordeal began long before the actual event. Girls were taught to guard their modesty relentlessly, avoiding any physical risk that might compromise them. Their movements, clothing, and interactions were policed with increasing intensity as marriage approached. Even activities as innocent as horseback riding or dancing were discouraged, not for their danger, but for the imagined threat they posed to the fragile proof required later. The responsibility of preserving this proof fell solely on the girl, though she had never asked for it. What made the ritual truly chilling was the way it was framed as diplomacy. Parents described it as a necessary courtesy to the groom's family, a sign of transparency and goodwill. The bride's discomfort was minimized because the examination was considered a gesture of respect between houses. This language hid the brutality of the custom. transforming an act of intrusion into something polite. In a society obsessed with appearances, the mere fact that the ritual maintained harmony was enough to justify it. Behind closed doors, however, many young women felt the weight of humiliation. Some wept quietly after the midwives left, others sat still, trying to understand how their bodies had come to hold so much power over the lives of people around them. The inspection reminded them that their physical state, more than their character or intellect, determined their role in the world. It was the moment their private selves dissolved into expectation and judgment. The moment they realized that marriage would not restore autonomy, but further erode it. The ritual endured because it served a purpose, even if that purpose was steeped in fear. Families feared scandal more than cruelty. They feared dishonor more than injustice. The inspection provided the illusion of control in a world desperate to maintain order through rigid customs. The bride, standing alone in that small room, bore the consequences of a system designed to value certainty above humanity. This ritual confirmed alliances, while diminishing the very person meant to uphold them. Deeper demands were waiting beyond this inspection, each tied to expectations she could never refuse. More than one household learned that proving innocence was only the first test imposed on a new bride. Pregnancy in Tudor noble society was never treated as a private experience of a woman's body. It was regarded as a national obligation disguised as domestic duty. From the moment a bride entered her husband's household, eyes turned toward her with an unspoken expectation that she would produce an heir, specifically a male one. Her body, which had already been measured and evaluated before marriage, now became the center of a quiet but relentless surveillance. Every change in her appetite, her complexion, or her posture carried political meaning. Servants analyzed her routines, family members exchanged hopeful glances, physicians circled discreetly, waiting for signs that the alliance they had engineered would bear fruit. A noble woman had little space to understand her own pregnancy. She lived in a state where others interpreted her every sensation as progress or failure. Her swelling belly became proof, not simply of new life, but of her usefulness. Families considered her pregnancies part of their political calculations, believing that a son would secure their legacy, strengthen their alliances, and stabilize their standing in court. A daughter brought polite congratulations but quiet disappointment. A miscarriage brought fear. A stillbirth provoked whispers. And the woman at the center of it all had no room to express her grief. For sorrow could be mistaken for guilt. Doctors, midwives, and attendants watched her closely, though not out of personal concern. They carried the weight of ensuring that nothing disrupted the plans of the household. Her daily activities were adjusted to protect the unborn heir. She was told to walk slowly, avoid drafts of air, rest often, and follow strict dietary instructions. Some of these restrictions were grounded in medical beliefs of the time. Others were rooted in superstition. In either case, she understood that any misfortune would be attributed not to fate, but to her negligence. Her pregnancy was a performance she could not afford to fail. The pressure intensified as the months advanced. If her belly grew at an acceptable pace, the household relaxed slightly, believing their future secure. If it did not, tension rose. Physicians were summoned more frequently, their faces solemn as they watched her movements. She felt the weight of their expectations with every breath, even before the birth. The unborn child was treated as a political figure, a symbol of continuity whose existence overshadowed her own. She became, in the eyes of many, a vessel rather than an individual. The cruelty of this system lay in its indifference to her suffering. Pregnancy could be dangerous, exhausting, or emotionally overwhelming. Yet these realities were rarely acknowledged. Her discomfort was considered irrelevant compared to the anticipated arrival of a male heir. Women who experienced repeated pregnancies without producing sons faced increasing scrutiny. Some were pressured to continue attempting childbirth despite physical exhaustion. Others were subtly blamed for conditions entirely outside their control. The human cost, though immense, remained invisible behind the polite facades of aristocratic life. When a pregnancy failed, the consequences extended far beyond personal grief. A miscarriage could be interpreted as weakness or incompetence, a sign that the alliance was flawed. Families viewed the loss as a setback in their long-term strategy, not as the devastation of a woman who had carried hope inside her body. She endured sympathetic words spoken with stiff politeness, but beneath them lingered disappointment. Some households responded by demanding immediate efforts to conceive again, as though grief could be erased by repetition. For the woman, there was no space to mourn. Her value was measured in successful births, not in her resilience or humanity. This harsh dynamic could also shift the balance of power within a marriage. A husband, once polite and distant, might grow cold if years passed without a male heir. Advisors muttered about alternative marriages or mistresses. Families began discussing contingencies that excluded her entirely. She lived each day, knowing her place in the household was conditional, dependent not on loyalty or affection, but on her ability to produce a son. The strain of this knowledge pressed on her more heavily than the physical demands of pregnancy. Even successful childbirth did not end the pressure. If she gave birth to a son, her value increased temporarily, but expectations for additional heirs soon followed. If she delivered a daughter, she was congratulated with restrained smiles and reminded gently, or not so gently, of the continued need for an heir. Her body remained a perpetual battleground of hope and anxiety, praised only when fulfilling the ambitions of others. There was little acknowledgement of the danger she faced with each pregnancy, dangers that often claimed the lives of women whose names were quickly forgotten once their usefulness had ended. The truth behind these expectations was simple and bleak. Noble society viewed pregnancy as political labor, not personal transformation. The woman's health mattered only insofar as it protected the unborn heir. Her fear, her exhaustion, her pain, these were sidelined in favor of larger objectives. The continuity of a family line took precedence over her survival. In this environment, motherhood became less an act of love and more an obligation bound tightly to the ambitions of powerful men. These pregnancies secured futures for others, while diminishing her own sense of self. Heavier demands were waiting once the child was born, each tied to the fragile balance of inheritance. Several women discovered that the life inside them was valued far more than their own. In Tudor noble households, the unborn child, especially a male one, was spoken of with a reverence that overshadowed every living woman in the room. Before the child even took shape, before a heartbeat could be felt or a movement sensed, families treated the pregnancy as a developing legacy rather than a fragile life. Conversations shifted from if to when, from possibility to expectation, long before the mother had made peace with the weight placed upon her. The fetus became a political commodity the moment its existence was suspected, an invisible figure whose imagined future already carried more worth than the experiences of the woman carrying it. During these months, a pregnant noblewoman felt her identity slowly replaced by the role she was compelled to fulfill. Relatives discussed her condition openly, assessing her strength, discipline, and compliance, as though she were an object under examination. Her own thoughts, anxieties, and uncertainties were rarely invited into these discussions. The focus remained fixed on the future heir, not the person whose body strained to bring him into the world. She moved through her home with a quiet awareness that her value depended not on who she was, but on what she carried. A male fetus held extraordinary power in this system. Before birth, before breath, he represented continuity and stability. Entire estates were spoken of in terms of what he would inherit. Plans were drafted around him, alliances strengthened in anticipation of him. Even in his silence, he reshaped the expectations of everyone around him. If the pregnancy showed promise, The household softened. If it faltered, tension spread through corridors like a cold wind. The woman's body became a battlefield where hopes clashed with realities she could not control. The fear of miscarriage hovered constantly, casting a shadow over every movement she made. Superstitions and medical beliefs blended into a strict regimen meant to preserve the fragile heir. She was told to eat more or less, to remain active yet avoid exertion, to rest frequently but not excessively. Every instruction contradicted another, leaving her uncertain which action might bring blame if misfortune occurred. The burden of responsibility rested entirely upon her, as though sheer willpower alone could guarantee the survival of a forming child. Failure, regardless of cause, would be recorded not as tragedy, but as inadequacy. Should a miscarriage occur, grief was rarely acknowledged in its true form. Instead, the loss might be interpreted as a political setback or, more cruelly, a betrayal of family ambition. Some whispered that the mother had been careless. Others speculated that she had not truly desired the child. In extreme situations, accusations of intentional harm emerged, especially when the unborn child was male. To lose such a child was to lose a piece of the future, and in a society that valued legacy above humanity, that future mattered more than her suffering. The woman's body was blamed even when circumstances lay far beyond her control. Her physical discomfort during pregnancy, the swelling, nausea, exhaustion, and fear, rarely entered the conversation. People viewed her primarily as the vessel through which the family's legacy passed. Privacy became a luxury she could no longer expect. Women who had birthed heirs before her commented freely on her condition. Physicians prodded and questioned her with no concern for dignity. Servants monitored her routines, reporting deviations with the same seriousness as political developments. Everything about her became data for others to interpret. What made the situation even more suffocating was how publicly this scrutiny unfolded. Her pregnancy was not her own experience. It was a shared investment. Guests at gatherings asked about her condition, not from empathy, but from curiosity about succession. Relatives analyzed her symptoms as though they themselves held stakes in her womb. Household staff speculated on the child's sex as though the outcome affected their future. Even those who barely knew her felt entitled to comment. Her body was no longer a private space, but a stage upon which the ambitions of the house were projected. When the child quickened, hope surged through the estate. When the child remained still, fear rippled quietly. Her emotions had to remain steady regardless of what she felt. Any sign of distress might cause people to question her commitment. She bore the physical and emotional strain of pregnancy without the freedom to confess weakness. Her body was expected to endure, to adjust, to comply, because something more important than herself depended on it, at least in the eyes of everyone else. The child inside her, though unseen, wielded more influence over her daily life than any person she had ever met. Decisions about her meals, her activities, even her sleep were guided by the unborn heir's theoretical needs. She had become secondary to him, despite being the one who carried the risk. If the child was born healthy and male, her place in the household improved. For a time, if the outcome differed, she faced subtle shifts in tone and treatment, reminders that her worth could rise or fall with the turn of fate. The deeper tragedy lay in how normalized this dynamic had become. Neither families nor society viewed their expectations as cruel. They believed they were protecting the future, safeguarding stability. The mother's suffering was simply the cost of continuity. Her vulnerability, her fear, her loneliness. These were expected to dissolve beneath the importance of the life growing inside her. This relentless focus on the unborn heir reduced her existence to the function of carrying another's future. Further expectations were waiting beyond birth, each one tied to duties she never chose. Many women realized too late that motherhood in noble houses demanded far more than a single life could sustain. A noblewoman's appearance in Tudor society functioned less as an expression of personal identity and more as a polished surface crafted to reflect the ambitions of her family. Every feature, her skin, posture, figure, and the controlled softness of her movements, was examined with a level of attention that had little to do with admiration and everything to do with strategy. People spoke of beauty as though it were a form of currency, something that could increase or diminish the value of an alliance. In corridors lined with tapestries and portraits, a woman's face became another display, one that silently communicated her family's standing. Even before she spoke, judgments had already been made. Her skin drew the earliest scrutiny. Pale, unblemished skin suggested refinement and noble blood, a life untouched by labor or hardship. Anything less, freckles, roughness, or a trace of sun, was viewed as a mark of inferiority, evidence that she failed to embody the ideal expected of her. Families, therefore, trained daughters to avoid sunlight, limit outdoor activity, and follow strict routines meant to preserve a fragile illusion of delicacy. Servants applied powders, oils, and herbs to smooth imperfections, each attempt reinforcing the idea that her worth depended on maintaining a surface free from any sign of human life. She was expected to appear untouched, even when the pressures around her pressed relentlessly against that expectation. Her body, too, was subject to evaluation. A slender waist hinted at discipline. Gently rounded features signaled fertility. The silhouette she presented to the world mattered more than her health. Women endured restrictive garments meant to mold their bodies into shapes that suited noble taste. Some suffered fainting spells, difficulty breathing, or persistence, but these discomforts were dismissed as minor inconveniences compared to the importance of maintaining an ideal form. The body was treated like a document that needed to be carefully edited, one mistake away from causing damage to the family's standing. Before formal events, the preparations intensified. Hours were spent arranging hair, adjusting gowns, applying cosmetics, and rehearsing the controlled expressions required of her. She knew that every glance and every whispered conversation at such gatherings concealed assessments. The men negotiating alliances observed her as though appraising a piece of land or a prized possession. Women from rival families scanned her figure and complexion for flaws that might be exploited in quiet conversations afterward. These judgments rarely reached her directly, but she felt their impact in the shifting tone of her family's expectations. The pressure to maintain an ideal appearance extended beyond gatherings. Even on ordinary days, she was urged to move with poise, keep her chin lifted, and maintain an air of calm elegance. Any deviation, fatigue, illness, or emotional strain risked raising questions about her suitability. In a household where appearances served as a political interface, her physical presentation was rarely allowed to slip. She learned to mask discomfort and suppress exhaustion because her body was constantly on display, even in the absence of an audience. When illness or stress affected her appearance, anxiety spread through the household. Relatives exchanged discreet comments, advising remedies or stricter regimens. Servants were instructed to adjust her clothing or cosmetics to conceal imperfections. The woman at the center of all this felt her identity dissolving beneath the expectations layered upon her. She understood that a moment's vulnerability, a blemish, a tired expression, a slight change in posture, could spark rumors. Those rumors, in turn, might weaken the negotiations surrounding her marriage prospects. The consequences of failing to meet these standards could be severe. A woman deemed insufficiently beautiful risked being placed in a less advantageous match, or in extreme instances, passed over entirely. Her value as a political instrument diminished if her appearance failed to meet the expectations of rival families. People spoke about such matters with disturbing calm, as though rejecting a human being for the state of her complexion or bone structure were as ordinary as evaluating the quality of fabric. The cruelty was normalized through repetition. Within her own household, she sometimes saw portraits of ancestors, women painted with idealized features, glowing skin, and serene expressions. These images served as reminders of what she was expected to emulate, even though she knew they concealed age, illness, and imperfection. The gulf between her lived reality and the idealized images weighed on her, deepening the sense that she could never fully embody what was demanded. The quiet tragedy of this system was its ability to consume a woman's sense of self. She learned to view her reflection not as a person, but as a presentation, a tool to be inspected and corrected. Flaws became threats. Natural variation became risk. Her family's ambitions were projected onto her face, her figure, and the controlled rhythm of her movements. She bore these expectations silently, aware that her appearance, more than her thoughts or capabilities, shaped her future. These expectations turned her body into an emblem long before she understood the cost. Deeper pressures were waiting beneath the surface, each imposed through standards she could never fully satisfy. Certain families discovered that beauty, once questioned, could unsettle alliances as swiftly as any spoken insult. Clothing in Tudor noble society was never merely decoration. It was a controlled display, a calculated presentation of status that concealed as much as it revealed. When a noblewoman stepped into the layers of fabric prepared for her, she did not simply dress, she entered a role. The wide skirts, stiffened bodices, and tightly drawn corsets shaped her body into an image that satisfied the expectations of the court, signaling refinement and restraint even when the garments made breathing difficult. What appeared elegant from a distance often felt like confinement from within. Yet the discomfort went unmentioned because attire served a purpose greater than her ease. Her appearance represented the ambitions of her family long before it expressed her own identity. The corset, perhaps the most defining element of her dress, dictated her posture with unforgiving precision. It narrowed her waist, lifted her torso, and forced her movements into controlled, deliberate rhythms. People praised the silhouette it created, admiring the disciplined shape as evidence of noble upbringing. Yet beneath those compliments lay the unspoken truth that her natural form was considered insufficient. The corset served as a reminder that her body required constant correction to match the ideal projected by the court. Physical strain, shortened breaths, aching ribs, and pressure that lingered long after the garment was removed were treated as a normal aspect of female nobility. Her skirt, supported by farthingales or padded layers, extended outward to create volume that suggested luxury and dignity. These wide forms restricted her steps, dictating the angle of her turns and the distance she could keep from others. The skirt's imposing shape was admired publicly, but it also isolated her physically, turning her into a figure meant to be looked at rather than approached. As she moved through corridors and halls, the rustling of fabric signaled her presence even before she appeared. The sound became part of her identity, echoing the subtle message that her body, elevated, shaped, concealed, was not entirely her own. Every ornament on her clothing served a purpose. Ribbons, lace, and embroidery hinted at wealth. Certain colours conveyed political allegiance or access to rare dyes. Specific cuts aligned with courtly standards. A noblewoman understood that the placement of a bow or the texture of a sleeve could shift perceptions of her status. These details were monitored not only by rivals, but by her own family, who ensured her clothing communicated their position clearly. Even the weight of her garments, heavy enough to strain her shoulders by evening, was seen as a privilege rather than a burden. The more elaborate her attire, the more successfully her family displayed their influence. Yet beneath these layers, the woman wearing them often felt the absence of her own shape. Her body became a framework on which others built their expectations. Servants tightened laces while discussing her upcoming appearances. Tailors adjusted fabrics while commenting on how certain cuts flattered or corrected her figure. She listened without protest, aware that she was being prepared for display. The discomfort she felt was considered secondary to the need for her to embody the polished ideal of courtly femininity. In this silent negotiation between presentation and reality, her body reduced itself to a foundation for garments designed to signal everything except her true self. When attending formal gatherings, she could sense how strongly her clothing influenced her reception. Admirers praised her elegance, attributing qualities of virtue, modesty, or grace based purely on the shape imposed by her attire. In contrast, any perceived flaw, a slightly loosened ribbon, a wrinkle in the fabric, a color deemed inappropriate, could prompt subtle criticism. Her garments spoke before she did, determining whether she was taken seriously in conversations or dismissed quietly. The complexity of this social language forced her into unwavering vigilance, forever aware of the messages her clothing transmitted. The physical strain of these garments grew more taxing with time. Hours spent standing in rigid dresses left her legs numb. Tight bodices made eating and breathing difficult. Heavy skirts caused persistent back pain. But she was taught to endure these sensations with composure, for discomfort was considered a necessary part of nobility. A woman who complained risked being labelled as weak or unrefined. Silence became her only outlet, reinforcing the idea that suffering, for beauty, for status, for political advantage, was an expected aspect of her role. Even outside formal events, her clothing maintained its grip on her identity. Mourning garments were less ceremonial, but still structured enough to remind her of her position. She could never move freely or dress for comfort without risking judgment. The garments created a barrier between her inner life and the world, shaping how others perceived her and how she perceived herself. Over time, the distinction between her body and the image crafted around it began to blur. She came to understand that her appearance was not for her benefit, but for the expectations of those who depended on her to maintain their status. The deepest irony of this system lay in the way clothing both concealed and exposed power. By hiding her natural figure, the garments projected an idealized version of femininity crafted by tradition. Yet by forcing her to embody that ideal, they exposed the political importance of her appearance. She became, simultaneously, a symbol and a participant in a structure that valued her presentation over her comfort. Every stitch and seam reinforced her role within the hierarchy, binding her to a system she had no voice in shaping. These garments displayed her status while quietly erasing her presence beneath their weight. There were more subtle demands embedded in her attire, each designed to mold her into a figure she barely recognized. Several women learned that the cost of looking perfect often exceeded the strength they had to give. In Tudor Noble society, the marriage bed served purposes far beyond intimacy. It was a stage on which alliances were confirmed, futures were secured, and reputations were either strengthened or quietly dismantled. The first night of marriage, treated by many as a private moment between two people, became instead a procedure watched indirectly by households desperate for proof that their political investment would hold. Servants lingered nearby. Matrons waited to hear movement behind closed doors, and members of both families expected a report by morning. What should have belonged to the couple alone was transformed into an obligation performed for the sake of others. Expectation hung heavily in the air as the newlywed bride prepared for the night. She understood that her behavior would be judged, not only by her husband, but by those waiting outside the room. Her body, already shaped by countless demands long before marriage, now had to perform yet another role. Success was defined not by comfort or connection, but by evidence. Marks on sheets, whispered confirmations, the stiffness of her movements in the morning. These signs became talking points for those who believed they had a right to evaluate the couple's private moments. Even silence could be interpreted as a sign of failure. Rumors filled the spaces where facts were scarce. People speculated about compatibility, desire, and performance with a confidence that ignored how little they truly knew. A bride's ability to please her husband, a concept rarely articulated directly, circulated through households as though it were a measure of her character. Servants repeated overheard phrases. Distant relatives shaped entire opinions based on subtle expressions at breakfast. The woman at the center of these conversations learned to fear casual glances, knowing how easily they could twist into stories about her abilities or inadequacies. Her worth, once again, was tied to something she could not control. A husband's words, even spoken without intention, carried tremendous weight. If he hinted at dissatisfaction, whether through complaint or careless remark, the consequences spread quickly. His family might question the match. Advisors might suggest alternatives. The alliance formed through marriage rested on the assumption that the union could produce heirs, and any suggestion of disharmony threatened that expectation. Even if the husband himself remained silent, others looked for signs in the way he treated his wife, interpreting every gesture through a political lens. Intimacy became a performance to be monitored rather than a personal connection. For the bride, the pressure was suffocating. She entered the marriage with little understanding of what was expected of her. Yet, she faced the possibility of disgrace if she failed to meet standards never clearly defined. Fear of disappointing her husband, fear of disappointing her family, and fear of losing her place in the household layered themselves inside her mind. Each night carried the potential for scrutiny. Each morning brought the possibility of whispered speculation. She learned quickly that her husband's satisfaction was not merely a personal matter, it was a requirement for maintaining her standing. If the couple failed to consummate the marriage promptly, the situation escalated. Families demanded explanations. Physicians were summoned to evaluate the bride or groom, searching for physical reasons behind the delay. The intrusion reached levels that stripped the couple of privacy entirely. Failure to produce evidence of consummation could result in annulment, a public declaration that the marriage had never been valid. For the bride, such an outcome posed a grave risk. She might be blamed, humiliated, or returned to her family in disgrace. Even if she had done nothing wrong, the stain of suspicion lingered long after. Annulments served political purposes as much as personal ones. When alliances weakened or circumstances changed, families sometimes used claims of failure of duty as justification to dissolve marriages no longer beneficial. The bride's body became the lever by which agreements were broken. Her conduct, real or imagined, provided convenient grounds for escape. Even when the marriage continued, the threat of annulment remained, shaping her behavior and reinforcing her vulnerability. She lived with the knowledge that her place depended on fulfilling expectations she did not set. Beyond the first night, the marriage bed remained a space monitored indirectly by the household. The couple's intimacy, or lack of it, was interpreted as a sign of the relationship's strength. Servants reported how often the husband visited his wife's chamber. Family members observed the couple's interactions, searching for clues about their closeness. The arrival or absence of pregnancy confirmed or contradicted these impressions. The woman's body, once again, served as the primary indicator of marital success. If no child appeared, she bore the blame, regardless of the truth. What made this dynamic particularly harrowing was how natural it seemed to those who upheld it. Families believed they were protecting their interests by ensuring the marriage functioned as intended. They saw the intrusion not as cruelty, but as diligence. The concept of privacy held little meaning in a world where every aspect of a noblewoman's life existed to support political structures. Her body was both foundation and proof of the alliance, and so her intimate experiences were treated as communal knowledge rather than personal memory. Inside this system, love and desire struggled to survive. A woman learned to accept that intimacy was not her own, but a duty she owed to the ambitions of those around her. Affection, if it appeared at all, emerged despite the pressure, not because of it. The marriage bed, instead of offering solace or companionship, often reminded her of the limits of her autonomy. She fulfilled expectations quietly, knowing that silence protected her more effectively than honesty ever could. These expectations turned intimacy into an obligation, leaving little room for anything resembling choice. Deeper intrusions awaited in the household, each reinforcing how little control she held over her own body. More than one family learned that when private moments became public property, alliances grew far more fragile than they appeared. In Tudor noble society, infertility was never approached as a shared burden. It settled immediately, almost automatically, upon the shoulders of the woman, regardless of evidence or reason. When a marriage failed to produce children, no one questioned the husband's strength or health. Attention turned instead to the wife, whose body was examined, whispered about, and quietly judged. The absence of an heir became a problem she was expected to solve, even when she had no means to alter the circumstances. In a world where lineage dictated power, the inability to conceive was treated not as misfortune, but as failure. From the earliest signs that a pregnancy was not forthcoming, pressure intensified. Relatives studied the woman's routines, searching for flaws in her behavior. Advisors suggested remedies, diets, and rituals meant to correct what they assumed was her deficiency. Servants carried out tasks with an edge of pity, their glances lingering on her belly before they turned away. She felt these expectations in the silence of the household, in the careful avoidance of direct questions, and in the heavy politeness that replaced sincere conversation. Each passing month deepened the suspicion that her body lacked the capacity to fulfill its role. Language reinforced the cruelty. People spoke of barren land and fruitless branches. Metaphors intended to distance themselves from the harshness of their judgment. A woman unable to conceive was referred to as unproductive, as though her worth could be measured like a failing crop. Behind closed doors, the words sharpened further. She was labelled as the obstacle, preventing her family from securing its future. A body that refused to bloom despite repeated attempts. These expressions were delivered calmly, sometimes even sympathetically, yet their implications carved deeply, marking her as a point of weakness within the household. Meanwhile, the possibility of male infertility remained largely unconsidered. A husband's health was presumed stable, his virility unquestioned, even when evidence suggested otherwise. Families deflected suspicion away from him, preferring to believe in flawless lineage rather than admit vulnerability. Physicians, when consulted, tended to examine the wife more thoroughly than the husband, reinforcing the assumption that her body was the source of the failure. She endured prodding, questioning, and treatments that ranged from ineffective to harmful, all under the belief that responsibility lay with her alone. As time passed without pregnancy, tensions in the household grew. Conversations between husband and wife became strained, shaped by unspoken disappointment. The husband, pressured by family expectations, sometimes withdrew emotionally or physically, leaving the woman to carry the weight of the situation alone. Advisors quietly suggested alternatives, additional attempts, outside consultation, or, most ominously, the consideration of replacing the wife altogether. The marriage, once viewed as a political contract, now felt like a test she had already failed. For many women, the looming threat of being set aside dominated their thoughts. Annulments were rare but not unthinkable, especially when a noble line risked extinction. Families considered the matter with chilling practicality, evaluating the consequences of returning the wife to her relatives. Diplomatic letters were drafted discreetly, seeking a new bride who might succeed where the first had not. Even when a woman was not formally dismissed, the arrival of a mistress or secondary wife signalled her diminishing place. The household shifted around her, offering polite courtesy while quietly redirecting hope towards someone else. Living under this cloud of expectation, she learned to navigate her days with careful composure. She monitored her body relentlessly, searching for signs that might restore her standing. Each imagined symptom sparked a moment of hope, followed by the heavy disappointment of reality. She endured well-meaning advice from women who believed they understood the secret to conception, as well as critical remarks from those who believed she had not tried hard enough. The more she tried to hide her sorrow, the more her silence was mistaken for guilt. The psychological toll left a mark no one acknowledged. Nights were spent in anxious reflection, mornings in quiet dread. She questioned her worth, not as a wife, but as a person, because the world around her insisted that her value depended solely on her ability to produce an heir. Even acts of kindness felt conditional, offered only when people believed she still held potential. Whenever hope faded, so did the warmth in their voices. Her body, already weighed down by expectation, became the focus of endless scrutiny. Remedies, tonics, and elaborate rituals were imposed upon her, each one promising restoration. Some treatments caused discomfort or illness, yet she was told to persist for the sake of the family. Her own desires disappeared beneath the urgency of producing a child. She lived in a system determined to mold her into a vessel for inheritance, even if it meant breaking her spirit in the process. What made this cruelty so enduring was the belief that it was justified. Families saw themselves as protecting their line, acting out of necessity rather than malice. The woman's suffering was viewed as an unfortunate side effect of responsibility. No one questioned the fairness of the expectations placed upon her, because tradition had long dictated that the burden belonged solely to the wife. She became trapped within a narrative written generations before her birth, unable to escape the role imposed upon her. These expectations turned her body into the assumed source of failure long before truth was ever considered. Deeper injuries were waiting beneath the silence, each one rooted in a tradition that refused to shift. Some wives learned that in the absence of an heir, even their loyalty could be dismissed without hesitation. Political tension within Tudor noble families often collapsed inward, striking the one person least equipped to defend herself, the wife. When alliances weakened, when negotiations stalled, or when rival houses gained ground, frustration required a target that could be blamed without consequence. A noble woman, bound to her marriage, yet excluded from political decisions, became the silent repository for anger others refused to direct at themselves. Her body, once celebrated as a symbol of unity, now served as the surface onto which disappointment and resentment were projected. The shift from praise to suspicion happened with alarming speed. At the beginning of a marriage, her presence was hailed as a strategic blessing, an elegant figure representing peace between families. But when fortunes changed, compliments faded, and doubt crept in. Conversations grew colder, glances sharper. Advisors muttered that the marriage had brought little luck. Relatives exchanged knowing looks when her husband entered the room in a foul mood. Without any evidence or wrongdoing, she became the explanation for tensions she never created. Rumors followed her long before accusations did. Servants repeated fragments of overheard conversations, piecing them together into narratives of blame. Distant cousins and court visitors speculated openly about her influence, claiming she had disrupted alliances or worsened diplomatic failures. These remarks circulated with increasing confidence, ignoring the obvious truth that she held no authority in matters of strategy, territory, or inheritance. Yet the simplicity of blaming her made the rumor enticing. The harder reality, that powerful men had miscalculated, was far less convenient. Her husband, pressured by advisors and family, often absorbed these whispers until they shaped his perception. A marriage once built on mutual politeness, or even affection, gradually hardened into emotional distance. She noticed it in the way he paused before speaking, the way he seemed to study her as if reassessing her worth. When he suffered political setbacks, he returned to her chambers with a silence heavier than anger. She recognized the shift. The household expected her to absorb the disappointment that no one dared direct at him. Family members reinforced the pattern. They asked pointed questions about her conduct, her interactions with others, and her behavior at gatherings. These inquiries were always framed as concern, never as accusation. But their tone betrayed suspicion. They evaluated her gestures, her expressions, even the way she walked into a room. A single misinterpreted movement could be treated as disrespect or evidence of disloyalty. The scrutiny became a daily weight, pressing against her until she learned to measure every action with quiet caution. Political conflict amplified these tensions. When disputes arose between noble houses, her body became a symbolic battlefield. If negotiations broke down, people claimed she had brought misfortune. If hostile rumors spread, they insisted her presence had weakened the alliance. Even illness or exhaustion on her part could be repurposed into narratives of incompetence. The absurdity of these claims did nothing to soften their consequences. She remained trapped in a script that declared she was responsible for outcomes entirely beyond her reach. As suspicions deepened, punishments followed. Some women were confined to private quarters under the pretext of protecting their dignity. Others were publicly shamed, their reputations dismantled through carefully crafted rumors. A husband seeking to distance himself from political failure might accuse his wife of infidelity, disobedience, or treachery, charges difficult to disprove and devastating in effect. In extreme cases, the consequences turned fatal. A noblewoman could be executed not for crimes she committed, but for alliances her husband failed to protect. Such actions were justified with chilling logic. Families convinced themselves that removing the wife restored honor or stabilized political ties. They argued that their decisions served the greater good of the dynasty. In reality, they simply needed someone vulnerable enough to bear the blame. A wife had no power to resist. Her silence was interpreted as admission, her protest as proof of guilt. The more she struggled to assert her humanity, the more tightly the narrative enclosed her. Within the household, she lived under constant alertness. She analyzed every word spoken to her, every expression directed her way. Nights became exercises in restraint, mornings in emotional recovery. She learned to fear the sound of footsteps in corridors, the arrival of letters, the quiet gatherings of advisors behind closed doors. Any shift in the political landscape could turn her life upside down with no warning. Her survival depended on anticipating the moods of others, men who saw her as both asset and scapegoat. The tragedy lay not only in the suffering she endured, but in the inevitability of the pattern. A wife who secured political success was celebrated briefly, yet still regarded as replaceable. A wife blamed for failure, however unfounded, faced consequences no man in her position would have encountered. She lived in a system that granted her responsibility without agency, expectation without support, duty without protection. Her story echoed across generations. Many women entered noble marriages with hope, only to discover that affection, dedication, and loyalty offered no shield against the weight of political disappointment. The same body used to cement alliances could be used to absorb their collapse. These expectations turned her into the vessel for anger that others refused to acknowledge as their own. Harsher punishments were waiting when ambition fractured, each aimed at the wife long before the truth was understood. Many marriages revealed that when politics crumbled, the first casualty was the woman who had no power to alter its course. Religious doctrine shaped nearly every aspect of Tudor marriage. but nowhere was its influence more forceful than in the realm of reproduction. The Church's teachings were woven into daily life with such authority that a woman's capacity to conceive was treated not simply as a physical function, but as a sacred obligation. Avoiding pregnancy, whether through intention, fear, or exhaustion, was framed as resistance against divine will. Under this worldview, her body did not belong entirely to her. It existed as a vessel, expected to receive whatever purpose God assigned through childbirth. The pressure operated quietly, yet relentlessly. Married women were told that their most virtuous act was bearing children, and that denying conception was equivalent to denying God Himself, even when pregnancies placed them in danger, even when their health deteriorated with each birth. They were reminded that suffering could be holy. Clergy praised endurance, preaching that pain in childbirth was a spiritual burden inherited from Eve, a burden redeemed only through obedience. This teaching blurred the line between faith and coercion, leaving women with little room to define their own boundaries. Within noble households, the overlap between religion and politics intensified these expectations. A child did not simply represent the continuation of a family, it symbolized divine approval of the marriage. Each birth reinforced the legitimacy of the household, suggesting that God favored its alliances and ambitions. Women were celebrated for producing heirs, yet the celebration centered not on their labor, but on the belief that God had chosen to bless the union. Gratitude was directed upward, not toward the mother who endured the risks. The opposite was equally true. When pregnancies failed, suspicion turned toward the wife. Miscarriages were framed not as tragedies, but as warnings. Some claimed that God withheld children because of hidden sin, improper behavior, or a lack of spiritual devotion. These accusations were rarely spoken plainly, yet they lingered beneath every cautious glance and rehearsed prayer. A woman mourning a lost pregnancy often had to grieve in solitude, knowing others interpreted her loss as a divine judgment. Banning contraception further tightened the cage around her choices. Church authorities declared that interfering with conception was an act against God's design, equating it with moral corruption. Even rudimentary methods to herbs, timing, or intentional abstinence were condemned. Husbands, encouraged by religious teaching, insisted that denying marital intimacy was sinful. The wife's consent mattered little. Her duty was to accept whatever God placed inside her womb. This dynamic left countless women trapped between fear of pregnancy and fear of spiritual condemnation. Those who tried to control their fertility faced severe social consequences. If a woman hinted that she wished to avoid another child, she risked being labeled irreligious or ungrateful. Neighbors might whisper that she had grown proud or rebellious. Family members accused her of shirking her responsibilities. In noble courts, any rumor suggesting reluctance to conceive could destabilize a woman's standing entirely. Her devotion was measured not by her prayers but by her pregnancies. The Church played a central role in formalizing these expectations. Sermons described children as blessings sent directly from God, implying that refusing them was akin to rejecting grace. Religious literature stressed the sanctity of motherhood while minimizing the physical danger it carried. Confessors instructed women to abandon fears of childbirth, urging them to replace anxiety with obedience. Even medical practitioners, influenced by religious doctrine, framed pregnancy as a spiritual mandate rather than a medical condition requiring caution. As a result, many women internalized the belief that they had no rightful claim over their reproductive lives. They approached each pregnancy with resignation rather than choice, hoping for survival while preparing themselves for loss. The emotional toll deepened with each birth, yet few dared to voice hesitation. Silence was safer than confession. Vulnerability was mistaken for sanctity. Noble women bore an additional burden. Their children represented more than personal fulfillment. Each birth proclaimed the legitimacy of their husbands, their families, and their alliances, Asson, in particular, reinforced dynastic continuity, strengthening claims to land, titles, and influence. To the outside world, the newborn symbolized divine endorsement of political ambition. No one questioned the cost paid by the woman whose body brought that symbol into existence. The sacred language surrounding childbirth masked the cruelty embedded within it. People celebrated the woman as a mother, while refusing to acknowledge the danger she faced. If she survived, her endurance was praised as a virtue. If she died, her death was framed as noble. The cycle continued because the doctrine supporting it presented suffering as meaningful, even necessary. Women learned to accept pain as part of their spiritual identity, not because they lacked awareness, but because rejecting the expectation meant challenging an entire belief system. Over time, the tension between personal fear and religious duty settled into a quiet ache. Women carried this ache alone, hidden beneath layers of compliance. They prayed for healthy children, for safe deliveries, for strength to endure another pregnancy, all while doubting their ability to survive it. Their bodies struggled under the weight of repeated expectation. Yet society celebrated only the outcome, not the sacrifice. These expectations turned childbirth into a ritual of obedience rather than an act of personal choice. There were deeper restrictions embedded in doctrine, each designed to shape the mother into an instrument of divine and dynastic purpose. Several households discovered that faith, when used as command, could bend a woman's life more tightly than any political decree. Accusations of infidelity carried a weight in Tudor noble society that no woman could escape, no matter how loyal or restrained she remained. A single gesture, a misunderstood glance, or a passing conversation could spark suspicion powerful enough to reshape the course of her life. The marriage she served dutifully, the alliances she upheld through obedience, and the dignity she maintained with careful restraint could all be undone by nothing more than an insinuation. Once the rumor began to circulate, her body became the first and only piece of evidence examined, whether the allegation held true or not at all. Scrutiny descended quickly. Her movements were monitored, her interactions re-evaluated, and her expressions passed for hidden meaning. A polite greeting to a male servant could be reframed as improper familiarity. Standing too close to a visiting nobleman could be interpreted as an invitation. Even silence could betray her, for people often assumed that a woman with nothing to say must be hiding something. The more she tried to behave cautiously, the easier it became for others to misinterpret restraint as guilt. Families and advisors moved with alarming confidence whenever suspicion arose. They questioned servants, reviewed household routines, and dissected minor details as if assembling a legal case. Her reputation, built over years, was treated as fragile enough to collapse under the weight of hearsay. Those who once praised her modesty now wondered whether it concealed hidden motives. Every gesture of kindness or formality she had shown in the past could be twisted into evidence of deception. She found herself trapped within narratives shaped by the fears and imaginations of others. Punishment arrived long before proof. A woman accused of infidelity, even without evidence, faced immediate social consequences. Her husband might withdraw emotionally, leaving her isolated within the household. Her family's support grew tentative, dependent on whether the accusation threatened their own honor. Servants who once greeted her with respect now avoided her gaze. Shame settled around her like a physical boundary, separating her from the rhythms of her own home. Public humiliation was a common response for families wishing to restore their standing. Some noble women, though never proven guilty, were subjected to symbolic punishments meant to cleanse the household of disgrace. Their heads were shorn as a gesture of dishonor, a visual declaration that they no longer embodied the dignity expected of their status. Others were paraded before servants or confined to isolated rooms where only rumors could reach them. The act of punishment mattered more than its fairness. Authority required visible consequences. Imprisonment, both literal and social, followed many accusations. A woman could be locked in her chambers for weeks, denied visitors, and stripped of decision-making power. She might be relocated to a distant estate, effectively erased from public life. Even when families avoided legal action, they often imposed a quiet exile that left her reputation damaged beyond repair. Her name became a cautionary tale whispered to younger women, warning them of the dangers of stepping even slightly outside established norms. What made these accusations particularly devastating was the impossibility of disproving them. A woman could not produce evidence of innocence, for innocence left no trace. The very absence of proof could be interpreted as clever concealment. A husband determined to rid himself of a politically inconvenient marriage could exploit these ambiguities, using accusation as justification for annulment or punishment. The ambiguity of infidelity served as a powerful tool, one that required no consistency, only suspicion. The emotional toll carved deep wounds. She lived with the constant awareness that her body, once expected to symbolize virtue, now represented sin. Her gestures became tight, her breathing shallow, her voice measured to avoid further misinterpretation. Even innocence brought no relief. The knowledge that she was powerless against rumor reshaped her sense of self. She learned that maintaining dignity in the face of accusation required a kind of endurance few recognized or valued. Some women faced even harsher outcomes. In extreme cases, execution followed allegations of adultery, especially when the accusation threatened dynastic legitimacy. A wife suspected of bearing a child not fathered by her husband risked being treated as a threat to the entire lineage. Her body, the source of political continuity, was now seen as a danger capable of corrupting inheritance. The punishment for such perceived betrayal was not merely personal, it was enacted to restore familial and political order, regardless of truth. Despite the severity of these consequences, many accusations originated from misunderstandings, rivalries, or manipulation. Female rivals exploited suspicion to undermine each other's positions. Male courtiers used rumors to gain an advantage over political opponents. Households clung to blame as a means of avoiding more complicated truths. In this environment, a woman's life could be dismantled by forces she never saw, spoken by voices she never heard, and judged by standards she never agreed to. Her story, repeated across noble households, revealed how deeply fear and control shaped expectations of female behavior. She lived in a world where loyalty was assumed but never trusted, where innocence was expected but rarely protected, and where a single misinterpreted moment could overshadow years of devotion. These expectations transformed her reputation into a fragile boundary that others could fracture with a single whisper. There were harsher judgments waiting beneath every rumor, each one capable of erasing her standing without evidence. More than one union revealed that a simple glance, twisted into suspicion, could destroy a woman's life more swiftly than any proven betrayal. Marriages among Tudor nobles operated less as unions of affection and more as transactions built upon the perceived value of a woman's body. Families approached the selection of a bride with an attention to detail that mirrored the inspection of prized goods. Her posture, complexion, fertility, and even the way she walked were evaluated as indicators of what she might offer a household seeking strength, continuity, and reputation. The woman at the center of these assessments was expected to endure the scrutiny in silence, aware that each observation could raise or lower her standing before negotiations even began. The process started long before courtship. Families exchanged letters describing potential brides in terms that reduced them to physical attributes. A slender waist suggested discipline, a pale complexion communicated refinement, smooth skin implied purity. These features, though superficial, carried immense weight, shaping perceptions of worthiness. Conversations about a prospective match rarely included her personality, intelligence, or desires. Instead, focus remained fixed on her capacity to bear children and maintain appearances suitable for noble expectations. Fertility mattered more than any other trait. Even without medical certainty, families presumed they could predict a woman's reproductive future by examining her frame, her menstrual history, or the histories of female relatives. These details, often gathered without her consent, served as critical bargaining points. A bride believed to possess strong fertility prospects could elevate her family's position. One considered uncertain risked being dismissed entirely. This emphasis on reproduction transformed her body into a contract, its potential measured, debated, and valued in strategic terms. Any previous pregnancy, whether from marriage or rumor, dramatically lowered her prospects. Nobles feared entanglements that might compromise lineage. So a woman known or suspected to have conceived before the proposed union carried a stigma difficult to erase. Even miscarriages were interpreted as evidence of weakness. Families approached such past events with suspicion, demanding explanations that exposed the bride to shame while disregarding her emotional experience. The value assigned to her body was fragile, easily damaged by circumstances beyond her control. Physical marks, scars, birthmarks, discoloration, or signs of past illness were treated as flaws that diminished her desirability. Some families dismissed minor imperfections, but many saw them as symbols of vulnerability or spiritual deficiency. Mothers examined potential brides with a discerning eye, searching for any detail that could be used to negotiate lower dowries or leverage alternative matches. The woman's own perception of these marks mattered little. Society insisted they reflected her worth, shaping her fate through standards she never agreed to. The negotiations surrounding marriage often took place entirely outside her presence. Fathers and uncles evaluated her features as though she were an item on display, listing qualities they believed would secure favorable alliances. Dowries were calculated with cold precision, balancing the perceived value of her appearance and fertility against the political strength of the groom's family. The bride, though central to the discussion, had no voice in the matter. Her future was determined through conversations in which she existed only as a set of attributes. As preparations for marriage advanced, the scrutiny intensified. Advisors and servants monitored her posture, diet, and behavior to ensure she presented the ideal form. Any deviation from expected standards was noted and corrected. She learned to move with controlled elegance, to hide signs of fatigue, and to maintain composure even when garments restricted her breathing. Her body became a performance designed to satisfy the gaze of those who judged her without ever acknowledging the effort such discipline required. The emotional toll of being treated as a commodity left quite scars. She lived with the constant awareness that her value depended on maintaining an image shaped by others. Every blemish felt like a threat. Every illness, a potential catastrophe. She worried about growing older, about weight that shifted naturally, about conditions she could not control. Her reflection in the mirror became less a representation of herself and more a reminder of expectations she struggled to meet. Once the marriage was finalized, these pressures did not vanish. They transformed into new forms. Her husband's family continued to evaluate her body as though the negotiation never ended. If she conceived quickly, they praised her suitability. If not, they revisited old doubts, questioning whether they had misjudged her value. She felt their eyes on her during meals, gatherings, and ceremonies, always searching for signs that confirmed or contradicted their decision. Her role as wife required constant validation through her physical performance. This system inflicted harm, not through overt cruelty, but through persistent objectification. The bride existed within a world that measured her worth through standards she did not create, enforced by people who never asked for her perspective. She learned to navigate these expectations by shrinking her desires, burying her discomfort, and accepting that her autonomy mattered less than the alliances secured through her body. Her silence, mistaken for acceptance, reflected the absence of choices available to her. These expectations reduced her to a collection of traits assessed for profit, rather than a person with agency or desire. There were deeper burdens hidden beneath the negotiations, each reinforcing her role as a commodity shaped for political gain. Several families discovered that the value placed on a woman's body could shape her destiny more sharply than any vow spoken at the altar. The higher a woman rose in Tudor society, the less her body belonged to her. For queens, the boundary between self and state dissolved entirely. Every movement, every symptom, every breath was observed not as a personal detail, but as an indicator of the kingdom's stability. Her body carried the weight of succession, diplomacy, and national identity, absorbing expectations so vast that they left no space for private desire. She lived within a structure where the crown claimed ownership of her physical existence, turning her into both symbol and instrument of dynastic continuity. A queen's most scrutinized duty was producing heirs. From the moment she married, advisors, courtiers, and foreign ambassadors monitored her closely, waiting for signs of pregnancy. Whispers rose the instant she appeared fatigued or nauseous. A missed ceremony sparked rumors across the realm. Even her clothing choices were interpreted for clues. The expectation was relentless. She must conceive, and she must conceive a son. Her value as wife and monarch rested on fulfilling this demand, regardless of her health or fear. The notion of refusal did not exist. A queen could not deny intimacy, no matter how exhausted, ill, or emotionally distressed she felt. Her body was tied to the duties of inheritance, and any reluctance was treated as negligence toward the realm. Advisors believed they had the right to intervene in matters as private as her menstrual cycle. Physicians examined her without hesitation, reporting details of her condition to the king and council. Personal boundaries, which other women might cling to in silence, dissolved under the gaze of power. Pregnancy intensified this intrusion further. The queen's chambers were filled with attendants assigned to monitor her constantly. They recorded her appetite, her sleep, her discomforts, and her movements. Each ache was interpreted politically. A bout of nausea meant divine favor or impending misfortune. A fall or fainting spell could trigger national anxiety. Her suffering was analyzed, not with empathy, but with strategic concern. What it meant for the succession, for alliances, for the king's authority. The queen learned quickly that her pain belonged to the kingdom, not to her. When labor approached, privacy vanished completely. Birth was a public event, disguised as a ceremony. Dozens of witnesses, noble women, midwives, attendants, sometimes even foreign observers, were present to verify legitimacy. The queen endured agony under watchful eyes, surrounded by people whose role was not to comfort her, but to ensure transparency. Her cries echoed through rooms filled with political expectation. The child emerging from her body carried the hopes of the dynasty, while she herself lay vulnerable, exhausted, and often afraid. Yet no one questioned the fairness of this burden. It was considered the natural duty of queenship. Even after childbirth, her body remained subject to scrutiny. If she recovered too slowly, advisors grew anxious. If she recovered too quickly, they speculated about future pregnancies. Her fertility was monitored like a national resource. Every pregnancy, every miscarriage, every postpartum complication influenced political decisions far beyond her control. A queen who miscarried risked being blamed for weakening the realm. A queen who bore daughters faced disappointment so palpable that it reshaped her position within the court overnight. The emotional toll of this existence carved deep, silent wounds. She lived with the fear of failure. Not personal failure, but failure measured in political consequences. Each time she felt pain, She wondered what new rumors would emerge. Each time she faced the risk of childbirth, she understood that her life could end without derailing the expectations placed upon her body. Queens died in childbirth often, and mourning them became secondary to celebrating the heir they left behind. Her body served the dynasty until it no longer could. Then the dynasty moved on. The expectation that her body belonged to the crown extended beyond reproduction. Her appearance was seen as a reflection of the monarchy's strength. Illness was interpreted as weakness in the throne. Weight gain, pallor, or fatigue sparked speculation in foreign courts. She was expected to present herself with unwavering dignity, even when carrying unbearable burdens. Her physical presence functioned as propaganda, proof that the monarchy remained steady. The queen learned to mask discomfort, to maintain posture even when pain radiated through her ribs, to smile when her body trembled. Behind these expectations lay a deeper truth. The state viewed her body not as a living, vulnerable human form, but as an extension of royal authority. Her discomfort was insignificant compared to the needs of the throne. Her desires were secondary to the demands of succession. The crown claimed everything: her privacy, her health, her pain, her potential. She occupied a palace filled with luxury. Yet her autonomy was more restricted than that of many common women. And still, she endured. She did so because she had no choice, because the role was thrust upon her, and because the survival of her children depended on her compliance. Power surrounded her, yet she possessed none over the most intimate parts of her life. A queen who failed to produce heirs risked dismissal, humiliation, or worse. A queen who succeeded was praised, but only for the child she delivered, not for the suffering she bore. Her story illustrates the extremity of Tudor expectations, where the body of a royal woman became both symbol and battlefield. She carried the weight of the crown long before she touched it, and she bore its consequences long after its shine faded. These expectations turned her into the monarchy's living foundation, even when the cost hollowed her from within. There were heavier pressures still, each rooted in the belief that her body was inseparable from the stability of the realm. Countless courts discovered that exposing a queen's suffering could weaken the throne with a force no enemy could replicate. Art in Tudor noble society rarely aimed to capture the truth of a woman's body. Instead, it reshaped her into a symbol crafted to serve the ambitions of those who commissioned the work. Portraits and sculptures did not reflect her lived experience. Her exhaustion, her illnesses, her aging, but rather the image her family wished to present to the world. Through carefully controlled lines, softened features, and strategically enhanced details, artists transformed her body into an emblem of fertility, virtue, and dynastic strength. The woman behind the artwork disappeared, replaced by a version of herself sculpted to satisfy political expectations. This transformation began long before the first brushstroke. Families discussed the portrait's purpose with the artist, specifying how they wanted the woman to appear. They emphasized qualities that symbolized good fortune: a full but not heavy face, bright eyes, smooth skin, healthy color, and a posture that conveyed dignity. Even if the woman suffered from illness or fatigue, the artwork erased those signs. Her body became a canvas on which others projected their hopes for lineage and influence. Fertility was among the most manipulated themes. Artists subtly widened the hips, softened the belly, or adjusted the posture to create an impression of maternal potential. A woman who had not yet conceived could be painted as though she carried the promise of many children. Families believed these visual cues suggested vuongteur, prosperity in offspring, even when reality told another story. Portraits circulated among nobles as symbols of strength, encouraging alliances by presenting the bride as physically suited for producing heirs. Age, too, became negotiable. Fine lines were smoothed, shadows softened, and skin brightened to convey vitality. A woman past her prime could appear youthful, while a young woman could be painted with a gravitas that signaled maturity. Sculptures carried these alterations further, chiseling away signs of frailty until only an idealized version remained. These modifications were not considered deception but refinement. Art's role was to present possibility, not truth. Health flaws or physical impairments were quietly concealed. If a woman had scars, swelling, or signs of chronic illness, artists were instructed to omit them entirely. A portrait displaying too much realism might damage her marriage prospects or undermine her family's reputation. Instead, she appeared serene and luminous, embodying a stability that her body may not have possessed. In this artistic world, imperfections threatened political narratives, and so they were erased as efficiently as rumors could be silenced. Clothing played an equally crucial role. Artists used elaborate gowns, jewels, and embroidery to communicate the woman's social standing. Hoops, stiff bodices, and layered skirts framed her body in shapes that suggested control and abundance. Even when the garments weighed heavily on her during the sitting, the portrait portrayed effortless elegance. Each detail conveyed wealth and legitimacy. The body underneath, compressed by corsets, restricted in movement, was insignificant compared to the impression produced for viewers. The symbolic manipulation extended to facial expression. Women were rarely allowed to appear emotional. Joy, fear, grief, or fatigue were deemed inappropriate for portraits intended to last generations. Instead, they were given a controlled, calm expression that implied discipline and nobility. This composed face became a mask, shielding the turbulent realities of noble life. Reproductive pressure, political anxiety, and domestic expectation behind an illusion of placid stability. As portraits circulated among courts, they functioned like diplomatic tools. Foreign ambassadors evaluated them when discussing alliances. Suitors judged potential brides based on painted attributes rather than personal knowledge. Entire negotiations occurred around these curated images. A woman's marriage, prospects, social standing, and political usefulness could rise or fall based on how convincingly her portrait embodied ideals that had little to do with her own identity. Meanwhile, the woman herself had little say. She sat for hours while artists captured a version of her that satisfied everyone but her. She recognized the distance between reality and representation. Yet she could not voice discomfort. To object risked appearing ungrateful or vain. Her silence allowed the portrait to become the public face of her private existence, shaping perceptions she could never fully escape. Over time, these idealized depictions influenced how society interpreted noble women more broadly. Viewers expected real women to resemble their portraits, forgetting that the images were crafted illusions. Natural aging or visible illness shocked onlookers who felt misled by the ideal. The pressure to match one's painted self weighed heavily, reminding women that even their physical reality struggled under the expectations imposed by art. Sculptures exaggerated this effect, carved from stone or molded in bronze. These works presented a permanence that portraits lacked. They froze women in timeless poses, their bodies shaped into symbols of lineage rather than living beings. A sculpture could depict a woman stronger, taller, or more serene than she ever felt. Once installed in a hall or chapel, it became part of the family's legacy, outliving her and retelling her story with details she never approved. The cumulative effect of these artistic practices was profound. A noblewoman learned that her true appearance mattered less than the symbolic version others preferred to display. Her body existed simultaneously in two forms: the vulnerable, human version she lived in, and the idealized form immortalized in art. One endured the strain of expectation, the other projected confidence and prosperity. Between these two selves, lay a quiet tension that defined her life. These expectations shaped her image into something polished and distant. Even when the truth beneath was fragile, there were deeper distortions hidden within artistic practice, each designed to mold her into an emblem rather than a person. Countless families discovered that portraits preserved power more faithfully than they preserved the woman forced to embody it. Midwives in Tudor noble society occupied a position both essential and perilous, moving silently between privilege and danger as they attended the most intimate moments of a woman's life. Their presence at births, examinations, and private household rituals gave them access to secrets that could sustain a dynasty, or destroy it with a single whispered remark. Without holding titles or land, they still wielded a form of influence that unsettled even high-ranking families. They understood that every room they entered, every cloth they lifted, every pulse they read on a frightened woman's wrist carried political implications far beyond the walls of the chamber. A midwife's authority began with her knowledge of the body. She understood changes in skin tone, subtle fluctuations in breath, the weight of a belly, and the texture of blood. While noblemen traded lands and negotiated alliances, she interpreted these signs to determine whether a pregnancy was viable, whether labor would be difficult, and whether a newborn appeared healthy enough to secure the family's future. Her judgments shaped expectations long before a child cried its first cry. These assessments were often treated as truth, even when they were merely predictions. In a world terrified of uncertainty, her voice anchored hope. Yet with this influence came exposure to danger. A single misinterpreted symptom could be seen as negligence. A difficult birth could lead to accusations of incompetence or sabotage. Noble families, desperate to protect their reputation, sometimes needed someone to blame when childbirth went wrong, and the midwife stood closest to the fire. She learned to measure her words carefully, to offer reassurance without promising outcomes, and to deliver gloomy predictions only when necessary. Every statement she made could be twisted into evidence of loyalty or betrayal. Her role extended beyond physical care. Midwives were often called upon to verify claims of pregnancy, to inspect the body for signs of previous childbirth, or to determine whether bleeding or injuries were natural or forced. These examinations rarely served the woman. Instead, they reassured the interests of men, families, and political alliances. A midwife's testimony could affirm a woman's innocence, or condemn her to social ruin. The room where she worked became a courtroom without witnesses, and her hands performed the acts that decided a woman's fate. This authority left midwives open to manipulation. Families sometimes attempted to bribe them to confirm pregnancies that did not exist, to conceal miscarriages, or to assert that a newborn was male, even when its features suggested otherwise. These pressures placed midwives in a moral tension that shifted with each household they served. Accepting a bribe could secure financial stability, but risk later exposure. Refusing one could provoke hostility or remove future employment. They lived within a precarious balance, aware that maintaining neutrality was nearly impossible. The politics grew more intense during labor itself. Noble households often crowded the birthing chamber with attendants, relatives, and servants, all watching for signs that the child belonged unquestionably to their lineage. A midwife's announcement of the infant's sex could spark tears of relief or collapse an entire family's ambitions. Boys meant succession and power, girls meant disappointment, negotiation, and renewed pressure on the mother. The midwife had to speak her words with steady composure, even as she felt the room tighten like a rope around her. After the birth, midwives became the keepers of secrets that would never be written in official records. They knew which women had miscarried and concealed it, which newborns were stillborn, which children were quietly replaced after illness, and which infants bore features raising questions of paternity. These truths remained locked within their memories. Revealing them might destroy households. Concealing them preserved fragile peace. Every decision carried consequences heavier than its modest station suggested. Many midwives formed complex loyalties. Some aligned themselves with the mother, protecting her from accusations of inadequacy or impropriety. Others aligned with the father or the ruling family, believing their duty lay in preserving the dynasty's public image. A few chose to align with their own survival, shaping their testimonies to the path that offered the safest future. None of these choices was simple. Each time they touched a woman's body, they stepped deeper into the machinery of political life. Despite their expertise, midwives remained vulnerable. They lacked the legal protections enjoyed by physicians and noblemen. Rumors could destroy them, and accusations, whether grounded in truth or fear, often led to expulsion, imprisonment, or worse. Their intimacy with women's bodies made them easy scapegoats when childbirth produced scandal or tragedy. This fragility forced them into silence, even when they witnessed injustices they could not speak against. Over time, their work shaped the emotional world of noble women. Expectant mothers often depended on midwives more deeply than on their own families. A midwife's presence offered reassurance, and her absence provoked fear. Within the confines of arranged marriages and political duties, she was one of the few figures who listened without judgment. But even that comfort came with limits. A midwife could not intervene when a woman was blamed for a miscarriage or punished for infertility. She could only witness and remain still, because challenging the household's authority placed her life in danger. In the end, midwives stood at the intersection of truth and silence. They knew more about the realities of noble women's bodies than any priest, physician, or husband. Yet their knowledge lived behind locked lips. Shaped by duty and fear, their hands brought children into the world, supported mothers through pain, and watched dynasties rise or fall with each fragile breath. And although history rarely recorded their names, their influence threaded through every family that depended on them. These unspoken tensions turned the midwife into a silent negotiator, guiding families through peril without ever claiming power for herself. There were deeper conflicts hidden beneath her practiced calm, each shaped by the secrets she was forced to carry alone. Numerous households discovered that the smallest truth, whispered by a midwife, could alter a lineage more sharply than any public decree. Women in noble households were raised to see their bodies not as spaces of personal experience, but as instruments assigned to a purpose, determined long before they were born. From childhood, they were taught that their worth depended on how well they could serve the ambitions of their families. Every lesson, every whispered warning, every gentle correction pushed them toward the same conclusion. Their bodies existed to fulfill duties that had nothing to do with their own desires. This belief shaped how they breathed, how they moved, how they prepared for a life that demanded more endurance than choice. The idea of duty became a constant presence in their lives. They heard elders speak of honor, lineage, and obligation, with the same tone used to describe natural laws. A woman's pain was not merely personal, it carried political meaning. A difficult pregnancy reflected on the strength of the family. A miscarriage threatened alliances. Even the ability to endure long hours of labor without complaint was celebrated as a virtue. These expectations formed a framework that surrounded them like walls, dictating how they were supposed to feel about their own bodies. In this environment, pregnancy was treated not as a transformation of the self, but as a contribution to the collective. The woman's discomfort belonged to the household. Her endurance was expected to be unwavering. Servants whispered that a noble woman who groaned too loudly during childbirth lacked dignity. Some families believed that suffering quietly showed readiness for motherhood. These standards had little to do with compassion. They were built on the belief that a woman's physical agony held value only when it served a political purpose. The cycle continued throughout adulthood. Each pregnancy was greeted with the same mixture of hope and tension. A woman might be surrounded by attendants, but she often faced her fears alone. The eyes watching her did not search for signs of emotional strain. They looked for signs that the body was performing its designated role. A healthy child meant the family's position strengthened. A stillborn infant or a series of miscarriages triggered doubts about her reliability. Her feelings, grief, guilt, and fear rarely shaped the household's response. The focus remained on outcome, not experience. This pressure shifted how women thought of their own health. Symptoms that might have drawn concern in another society were dismissed as part of their duty. Breathlessness, chronic exhaustion, and persistent pain were absorbed into daily life, treated as reminders of responsibility rather than invitations to rest. Many women learned to suppress discomfort, believing that acknowledging it suggested weakness. Over time, this suppression became instinctive, guiding their behavior even when no one else was watching. Pain itself gained symbolic weight. A noble woman who endured suffering without protest was admired. Her body became a demonstration of discipline and loyalty to her family's ambitions. This expectation forged a silent code among women, one endured because others before them had done the same. Even when fear rose sharply in the final weeks of a pregnancy, many chose silence. They wrapped themselves in composure, knowing their reactions would be scrutinized more closely than their well-being. In private moments, some women recognized the toll. They felt their bodies strain under the weight of repeated pregnancies and demanding rituals. They sensed their strength slipping away, but often lacked the language to articulate this loss. In a world that prized duty above self-understanding, expressing doubt seemed almost forbidden, so they separated their identity from their physical selves, creating a mental distance to survive. This quiet dissociation allowed them to continue fulfilling expectations, even when the burden became overwhelming. This internal division appeared in subtle gestures. A woman might speak of her pregnancy as though it belonged to the family rather than to her. She might describe labor as something she owed, not something she experienced. She might comfort herself with the thought that her suffering held value, transforming personal pain into political currency. These were the ways she protected herself, not by resisting expectation, but by reframing her relationship with her own body. This transformation deepened the further she moved into adulthood. Women who survived numerous childbirths often spoke of themselves with a detachment that startled younger wives. They had learned to accept that their bodies were not entirely under their control. They had become vessels for aspirations far larger than their own. This acceptance was not surrender, but adaptation. A method of navigating a world where society demanded more than any one person could reasonably give. In the quiet spaces of noble life, this mindset became a form of survival. A woman who believed her body existed solely for duty could endure more than a woman who expected understanding or compassion. The emotional distance protected her from despair when the demands became relentless. It also shaped how she taught the next generation, passing down the same lessons that had shaped her. The cycle persisted because breaking it required a kind of freedom no one offered her. These expectations pushed her to treat her own body as a duty she owed to others, rather than a life she could claim for herself. There was another layer beneath this obedience, one built on the belief that denying her comfort preserved the stability of her household. Countless women discovered that erasing their needs created a silence heavy enough to alter the fate of an entire marriage. There were moments in Tudor history when a woman's body became the decisive argument in dissolving a marriage. It did not matter what she thought, what she hoped for, or what kind of life she imagined. What mattered was how she appeared, how her features aligned with expectations, how her presence reflected the ambitions of a king or a noble family. In these cases, the judgment was swift, cold, and rarely questioned by those who benefited from the outcome. Anne of Cleves stands as one of the clearest examples. She arrived in England carrying the weight of a political alliance, her future already written, long before she stepped onto Tudor soil. The portrait Henry VIII had chosen suggested softness, grace, and the kind of beauty that reassured a king craving admiration. But when he saw her in person, that illusion collapsed. Her face did not match the painting. Her manner did not align with his fantasies. And her value, politically and personally, diminished in a single glance. A treaty could unravel because a man felt disappointed. The marriage was annulled quickly, wrapped in polite phrasing that disguised a humiliating reality. Anne was declared unattractive and therefore unsuitable. Her body was treated as a faulty object, delivered under pretenses. She was spared execution only because she accepted the humiliation with the quiet compliance expected of a discarded wife. What happened to her shows how little affection mattered. Beauty, or the failure to embody it, carried far more weight. This logic stretched far beyond queens. Noble women across the realm lived under the same fragile conditions. A husband could announce dissatisfaction with his wife's appearance and find support from those eager to shift alliances or secure property. Love was irrelevant. Desire was optional. What truly mattered was whether a woman's body enhanced the status of the man who claimed her. When it did not, she could be replaced without remorse. In many households, beauty functioned as a silent contract. A smooth complexion signaled health and fertility. A symmetrical face implied favorable lineage. A graceful carriage suggested discipline and virtue. Any deviation from these ideals, real or imagined, became evidence against the woman who bore them. Illness could be interpreted as weakness. Weight gain could invite whispers about laziness or moral decline. Even the slightest flaw might be cited as justification for separation. The hypocrisy of these standards was obvious even at the time. Men aged, grew ill, and indulged freely in pleasures without fear of losing their marital rights. Their bodies were rarely scrutinized. A man could be unattractive, unfaithful, or unkind and still be considered fully entitled to a wife who reflected honor upon him. Meanwhile, a woman's value could waver with the turn of a season. A pregnancy that changed her shape, or a rumor that she no longer pleased her husband. The cruelty lay not only in the judgments themselves, but in the public nature of the condemnation. When a marriage dissolved, the woman's appearance became a topic for court gossip, diplomatic letters, and even official records. She was transformed into a cautionary tale. Her private shame turned into political utility. Her body became a symbol, an example of how easily a woman could fall from favor simply because a man disliked what he saw. It was not uncommon for entire negotiations to hinge on the supposed appeal of a bride. Families polished their daughters like precious objects, promoting them through portraits, carefully staged meetings, and polished descriptions. Yet once married, those same daughters could lose everything if their beauty faded or failed to live up to expectations. A woman could be loved for her face in one moment and discarded because of it the next. In the most tragic cases, the accusations were sharpened into legal actions. A husband might claim his wife misled him, citing her appearance as evidence of deception. Courts listened. Councils deliberated. Alliances shifted. The woman had little say in what happened to her. She simply endured the public verdict, embedded in each word spoken about her body. Anne of Cleves survived her ordeal, but many others did not. Their stories were not recorded with the same detail. Their names lost to time. Their reputations reduced to a few lines about beauty or its absence. What remains is the understanding that in Tudor society, a woman's worth in marriage could be undone by something as simple and brutal as a man's disappointment. These judgments reduced her life to the narrow space between acceptance and rejection, all measured through the lens of appearance. There were deeper wounds left behind, each shaped by the knowledge that beauty functioned as currency her survival depended on. Many families discovered that a single complaint about a woman's face could redirect the course of an entire alliance. There were moments in Tudor households when the sight of a woman's swelling belly drew both celebration and fear. Pregnancy was not treated as a private milestone or a tender hope shared between two people. It was a public condition, monitored as closely as any political treaty, because a single child, preferably male, could determine the security of a lineage. In those months, a woman's body shifted from being a partner in marriage to becoming the vessel upon which a family's future depended. Every visit, every meal, every breath she took was watched with the same intensity given to court negotiations. A healthy glow invited optimism. A moment of dizziness sparked suspicion. Servants whispered about signs. Midwives made quiet predictions. And relatives waited as though the unborn child were a verdict that had yet to be spoken. No one asked what the woman felt. Her emotions were irrelevant compared to the destiny her body was expected to deliver. For many wives, this state of constant observation became a kind of confinement. The more her stomach grew, the more she disappeared behind the role assigned to her. She was no longer valued for her mind, her voice, or her daily presence. She was valued for what she carried. Each month that passed without complication was praised. Each moment of weakness was judged. The body that once belonged to her now served as a public instrument of dynastic ambition. The danger beneath this expectation lingered in every household. Tudor medicine offered little protection when childbirth went wrong. A slight fever, a prolonged labor, or a hidden infection could end a woman's life within hours. Yet these risks rarely softened the demands placed upon her. Families accepted the danger as an inevitable part of their pursuit of stability. If she died, they mourned, but they did not question the system that required her sacrifice. Many women knew what awaited them, because stories travelled quickly. Names whispered through corridors, tales of wives who went into labour and never returned. Bodies carried out in silence, while the cradle remained empty. But fear did not grant them any freedom. They were expected to try again, as though courage were measured in how many times a woman approached death for the sake of a male heir. Weakness was unforgivable. A wife whose body struggled under repeated pregnancies was not offered rest or understanding. Instead, she became an inconvenience. Families began to speak about her in practical terms. Whether she might recover, whether she could risk another birth, whether a different woman might better serve the lineage. Her worth declined not because she lacked devotion, but because her body could no longer sustain the demands placed upon it. Some husbands grew distant as their wives faltered. Their disappointment took quiet forms, shortened visits, whispered meetings with advisors, a tightening of the emotional distance already present in arranged marriages. Others responded with open frustration, blaming their wives for complications no one could control. The woman endured both the physical agony of pregnancy and the emotional weight of being perceived as a failing asset. When a wife died after childbirth, official mourning was often overshadowed by urgent discussions about remarriage. A new alliance had to be formed, a new womb found capable of delivering a future heir. The previous wife was remembered politely but briefly, her death treated as an unfortunate outcome of a necessary process. Her body, once praised for its potential, was now simply a closed chapter in the family's pursuit of continuity. The child she died delivering did not always survive, either, and when the lineage lost both mother and infant, the tragedy was recorded with a few lines in a family ledger. Its emotional impact submerged beneath questions about inheritance, property, and succession. The woman's life, her personality, her aspirations, her quiet moments, rarely appeared in those records. She was remembered through the lens of what she could give, not who she had been. In these stories, the cruelty lies in their ordinariness. Families did not view themselves as demanding or unreasonable. They believed they were acting in the interest of stability, fulfilling what tradition had long dictated. Women were taught to accept this reasoning, to interpret sacrifice as honor, and to see survival not as a right, but as a fortunate outcome. What remains most striking is how easily a single pregnancy could shift the entire structure of a marriage. The same woman who was once welcomed as a bride could become a liability if her body did not withstand the strain. The same belly that promised a future could also provoke fear, calculation, and Ultimately, loss. These expectations turned each pregnancy into a test that measured both her worth and her survival. There were deeper sorrows hidden behind the celebrations, each rooted in the knowledge that bearing life could cost her everything. Numerous households discovered that the rise or collapse of a lineage could hinge on the moment a woman cried out in labour. Marriages in Tudor England often carried expectations far heavier than affection or compatibility. A wife entered her husband's household with a single responsibility placed quietly but firmly upon her. She was to provide a male heir. This unspoken demand hung in the air from the day she arrived, shaping every judgment made about her body, her worth, and her future. A woman might be dutiful, intelligent, and deeply loyal, yet none of these qualities could shield her from the scrutiny that followed each pregnancy, each birth, each loss. Catherine of Aragon embodies this reality with painful clarity. She came to England as a princess, carrying the weight of diplomacy between kingdoms. And for a time, she fulfilled her expected role with grace. But the comfort of her position eroded with each stillborn child, each infant funeral, each fleeting hope that collapsed into mourning. Tudor society treated these tragedies not as natural misfortunes, but as signs of divine disapproval. Quiet doubts grew louder. Perhaps the marriage was cursed. Perhaps the Queen's body was flawed. Perhaps the dynasty would fracture unless decisive action was taken. Henry VIII eventually embraced this logic. His disappointment hardened into resolve. And the king, who once admired Catherine, now viewed her through the cold lens of succession. No decree was spoken immediately, but the shift in his demeanour said what words did not. Advisers sensed opportunity. Opponents sensed instability. And Catherine sensed that her identity as queen was being reconstructed around her failure to give England a son. While her heartbreak deepened, Henry's attention moved elsewhere, to Anne Boleyn, whose youth and confidence seemed to promise the future he desired. Affection may have played a part in this shift, but ambition played a larger one. Anne's value lay not simply in her presence, but in what her body might produce. She became the symbol of renewal, while Catherine became the embodiment of a dead end. For noble families beyond the court, this dynamic was painfully familiar. A wife whose pregnancies resulted only in daughters, or no children at all, often found her position weakening. Each childbirth was assessed like a financial report. Each daughter was quietly acknowledged, but offered little influence. And each loss created another reason for her husband's relatives to question her usefulness. A woman's value could shift dramatically in a single year, reshaped by the outcome of her womb rather than any aspect of her character. When disappointment repeated itself, the conversations around her began to change. Husbands spoke of burdens. Councils discussed alternatives. Families considered annulments. Even servants carried rumours between rooms, speculating about replacements before the wife herself heard a word. The cruelty lay not merely in the potential abandonment, but in the reduction of a living person to a biological performance metric. Descriptions used in these cases were disturbingly transactional. Wives were compared to land that failed to yield crops, or investments that had not brought a return. A woman who had once been praised as a suitable match could suddenly be labelled unsound or unproductive. It was not unusual for a man to claim, publicly or privately, that affection remained. But affection did not secure a dynasty. Some did. Some women responded by trying to make themselves indispensable in other ways. They strengthened diplomatic ties, managed estates, and fulfilled ceremonial duties flawlessly. Yet these efforts rarely altered the underlying expectation. Tudor society did not reward competence when fertility lagged. Even a wife who proved central to the political stability of a household could find herself discarded if another woman appeared more likely to bear a male heir. The arrival of a new wife often brought a sharp contrast. The former wife, now removed from public life, he watched her successor celebrated for youth, beauty, and perceived promise. Hope shifted from one body to another, while sorrow accumulated quietly in the life left behind. The dismissed woman's story became a footnote in the ambitions of the family she once served. Even when she retained titles or lands, her identity had been effectively erased and rewritten as a caution. Catherine of Aragon refused to accept such erasure. Despite pressure from the crown, she held her ground, insisting that her marriage was valid and her dignity intact. History remembers her resilience. Yet countless other women lacked such protection. They vanished into remote estates, convents, or obscurity. Their names carried only by scattered letters or brief mentions in legal documents. Their experiences reveal how deeply Tudor power relied on women's bodies, valued when fruitful, questioned when uncertain, and dismissed when considered obsolete. These expectations turned marriage into a fragile arrangement, dependent not on loyalty or partnership, but on the unpredictable outcome of a woman's womb. There were deeper fractures beneath each dismissal, shaped by the knowledge that a wife's worth could collapse through no fault of her own. Several unions unraveled the moment a newborn's cry announced the arrival of a daughter instead of a son. Death did not grant Tudor women the peace one might expect. Even after their final breath, their bodies remained subjects of suspicion, curiosity, and political necessity. A woman who had lived under scrutiny found that the same judgment followed her into stillness. The body she once carried with quiet endurance became an object to be examined, doubted, or displayed, its silence offering no protection from the demands placed upon it. In noble households, a woman's death often triggered procedures that reflected not grief but verification. Relatives gathered, officials took notes, and attendants waited for instructions. The purpose was rarely to honor the life that had ended. It was to ensure that the stories told during her lifetime aligned with the reality revealed by her remains. If she had died suddenly, the cause needed to be confirmed. If she had struggled with illness, that illness needed to be named. And if she had ever been touched by rumor, infidelity, infertility, or deception, her body became the final witness called to speak. Some families ordered examinations with disturbing precision. Midwives, physicians, or trusted attendants were instructed to check for signs that might confirm whispered suspicions. A woman suspected of concealing a pregnancy might have her abdomen opened. A wife rumored to have miscarried might have her womb inspected for remnants of truth. These acts, disguised as necessary investigation, served primarily to protect the reputation of the living rather than the dignity of the dead. The cruelty intensified when the woman's marriage had been politically significant. Her death offered an opportunity, or an excuse, to rewrite her story. If she had failed to produce sons, the examination of her body might be framed as medical explanation, a way to shift blame from the husband or the dynasty. If she had been accused of extramarital behavior, her remains were scrutinized for signs that would confirm guilt or restore honor. Her body functioned as evidence in disputes she could no longer defend herself against. In some cases, the process went further. Embalming revealed details that families preferred to hide. The removal of organs exposed sicknesses long masked by cosmetics and clothing. When rumors threatened political alliances, decisions were made not to preserve the body, but to manipulate its presentation. A pale complexion could be concealed beneath layers of wax. Sunken features could be padded. The dead woman was reshaped one last time, fitted not for life, but for the narrative required of her. Portraits painted after death followed the same logic. Artists were instructed to depict serenity, beauty, or piety, even when the truth was different. A woman who had suffered greatly in her final days might appear angelic on canvas. Her features softened to suggest purity and favor. The purpose was not remembrance, but control. Her body became a tool through which the living crafted their own legitimacy. Those who faced dishonor in life suffered more invasive indignities after death. A wife executed for treason or adultery might have her remains examined to validate the charges. The absence of such evidence rarely mattered. The examination itself reinforced the verdict. Her body became a stage upon which the state displayed its authority, even though her voice had already been silenced forever. Even burial did not guarantee safety. Graves of certain women were reopened years later, prompted by disputes over inheritance or questions of lineage. Bones were studied, compared, or relocated according to political needs. A woman who had once been central to noble affairs could find herself reduced to fragments, handled by strangers who did not know her name beyond the records they interpreted. Her identity was preserved only through the lens of utility, not humanity. What stands out most is how deeply reputation clung to a woman's body long after she ceased to inhabit it. A man's legacy was measured through titles, victories, and alliances. A woman's legacy, especially in noble circles, remained rooted in the physical form she left behind. If her body fit the expectations of purity, health, or fertility, her memory was softened. If her body revealed flaws, imagined or real, those flaws were used to define her, to explain her failures, or to justify the decisions of those who outlived her. This persistence of scrutiny shows how little autonomy Tudor women possessed. Even in death, their bodies continued to serve the ambitions of others, shaped and interpreted without regard for their lived experiences. What they felt, feared, or desired remained secondary to what their remains could prove. The silence of the grave did not shield them from judgment, it merely removed their ability to resist it. In the end, these invasions reveal how deeply the era believed that a woman's worth could be measured through examination, dissection, and display. Her life might have been filled with service, loyalty, or suffering, yet her body remained the final site upon which others established their claims. The dead woman could not speak, but her body was forced to do so, interpreted by those who needed answers, excuse, or closure. These practices turned death into another stage where a woman's identity was shaped by forces beyond her control. There were hidden humiliations beneath the rituals, each reflecting the belief that her body remained useful even after life had withdrawn. Various families learned that a woman's story did not conclude with her final breath, but with whatever truth others claimed her remains revealed. A Tudor woman's life carried the quiet weight of expectations she did not choose, bound to rulers she never met, and traditions she could never question. Her body absorbed the pressures of a world that decided her purpose before she could form her own desires. Every choice made about her, marriage, childbirth, duty, reputation, was shaped by forces far larger than her voice. In this landscape, she moved like a figure placed on a board long before she entered play, required to serve, required to yield, required to survive in whatever way the age allowed. Most women understood this from childhood. Lessons came early, taught through glances and gestures rather than words. A daughter learned to lower her eyes, to step lightly, to obey quickly. Silence became a shield, modesty a rule, the body an object to be guarded, not for herself, but for those who owned her fate. She grew into this shape slowly, molded by customs that prized obedience above ambition, purity above confidence, lineage above individuality. When she married, the expectations deepened. A wife became a vessel for alliances, a safeguard for inheritance, a symbol of honor her husband presented to the world. Her body was watched in ways that had nothing to do with affection or care. Relatives monitored her cycles. Midwives studied her health. Servants whispered about her household behavior. She lived inside a constant evaluation she could not escape, where each movement or misstep risked becoming evidence against her worth. If she bore children, Her identity contracted further. A fertile woman was praised, but that praise rarely belonged to her. It was claimed by her husband, attributed to God, or credited to the family line. She became the silent engine of continuity, expected to endure pain, loss, and recovery with the same steady calm. If she failed to conceive, or conceived only daughters, her usefulness dimmed in the eyes of those who measured life only through names carried into the next generation. Religious expectations layered over political ones. The church preached submission, sacrifice, and humility as virtues that defined womanhood. A Tudor wife heard constantly that her suffering held spiritual meaning, that endurance purified the soul. That silence was a holy gesture. The boundary between faith and duty blurred until she could no longer tell where God's will ended and human demands began. She submitted because the world told her submission was sacred. Tradition closed every remaining exit. Customs decided how she dressed, how she greeted visitors, how she behaved in public and private, how she carried grief, and how she celebrated joy. Even her laughter required moderation. Too much could be seen as frivolous. Too little could be interpreted as coldness. She navigated a narrow corridor of expectations, monitored by those who believed they were preserving order. But the order came at her expense. When conflict arose, political tension, family rivalry, failures in succession, the woman often became the scapegoat. Her body offered a convenient target. If a treaty soured, she was blamed for failing to produce a son. If rumors spread, she was blamed for attracting attention. If sickness struck the household, she was blamed for inadequacy. These accusations rarely needed proof. Repetition alone made them credible. Some women attempted resistance, though resistance of any kind carried its own dangers. A wife who questioned her husband's decisions risked being labelled insolent. A woman who refused a political marriage risked dishonouring her family. A queen who challenged a king risked the scaffold. Even subtle forms of defiance, hesitation, withdrawal, or quiet refusal could be interpreted as rebellion. And rebellion, in a world built on obedience, demanded punishment. The harshest truth of all was that protections seldom existed. Families protected their investments, not their daughters. Husbands protected their lineage, not their wives. The church protected its doctrine, not the bodies that suffered inside it. Society protected its structure, not the individuals crushed beneath it. A woman moved through life without a shield, her survival depending not on fairness but on fortune. When she died, her body did not escape the scrutiny that bound her in life. Examinations continued. Secrets were uncovered or invented, and narratives were crafted to fit the needs of the living. Her memory survived only through the interpretations of others, not through her own voice. The world took from her until nothing remained, except a name. Sometimes not even that. History often remembers Tudor women as footnotes in the stories of men. Wives, mothers, daughters, queens, recorded not for who they were, but for how they affected the ambitions of kings, councils, and dynasties. Their bodies shaped treaties, conflicts, and succession creases. Their suffering stabilized thrones. Their silence allowed kingdoms to function. And yet the record rarely shows them as individuals with thoughts, fears, or longing. Instead, they appear as fragments, glimpses, outlines drawn by observers who valued their utility more than their humanity. Looking back, it becomes clear why their lives resembled a battlefield. Forces collided upon their bodies: ambition, religion, tradition, lineage, reputation, and each collision left marks that shaped their futures. Some endured, some vanished, some resisted quietly, and some were broken by the weight of demands placed upon them. The tragedy lies not only in their suffering, but in the fact that so few recognized it as suffering. Their world normalized the violence of expectation and called it virtue. This final truth lingers. A Tudor woman could give everything: her obedience, her health, her children, her peace, and still disappear into history without a single sentence dedicated to her voice. She fought a war no one acknowledged. She bore wounds no one recorded. She lived within a system that never intended to protect her, only to use her. And when she vanished, the world continued unchanged, as though her life had been only a temporary necessity. These realities turned her existence into a quiet struggle carried beneath the surface of noble life. Rarely spoken, yet deeply felt, there were heavier burdens behind each duty she fulfilled. Shaped by forces she could neither escape nor influence. Several generations learned that the true cost of Tudor power was written not in laws or battles, but in the unprotected bodies of its women. Thank you for staying with this long journey through the unseen struggles of Tudor women. Rest well tonight, and may your dreams be gentler than the histories we have explored together. Good night.